Picture this. It's a Saturday morning, somewhere between 1992 and 1998. You pick your year. You know exactly which one I'm talking about. You wake up before anyone else in the house, and I mean before anyone, like 6:45 in the morning on a weekend, which if you know anything about today's kids, that does not happen. But back then, you couldn't sleep even if you tried because you knew what was waiting for you the minute you got up on a Saturday morning. You climb out of bed, you're in your pajamas, maybe it's a set, maybe you're just throwing on whatever, doesn't matter. Because you go down the stairs or walk across the hallway or whatever as quiet as you can, because if you wake up anybody else, now you got to share the TV, and we are not doing that this morning. First thing you do is you get to the kitchen. You grab the biggest bowl you can find, not a reasonable bowl, by the way, like a serving bowl, a bowl that has no business being used for cereal. And you pour in whatever was in the cabinet. Maybe it was Cocoa Puffs, maybe it was Lucky Charms, Fruity Pebbles. Maybe your mom was on a health kick and it was Raisin Bran, in which case, I'm so sorry. That was a form of punishment and you definitely didn't deserve it. Now you grab this bowl, this massive behemoth. You walk into the living room or back into your room. You click on the TV, and I do mean click because it was a physical button or a physical remote with actual raised rubber buttons. You know the ones that I'm talking about, right? Okay, the ones you had to press down with intention. And the TV doesn't come on instantly. It warms up. There's that half second of nothing. And then boom, the picture. And what's on that screen? Everything. Cartoons. Back to back to back. No streaming, no algorithm, no are you still watching? Just a schedule that some beautiful human at a network put together. And your only job, your only responsibility on this planet for the next couple of hours was to sit there and receive it. And nobody was going to bother you. Your parents were asleep, your siblings were either asleep or doing the exact same thing you were doing, possibly in another room or there next to you. There were no notifications, no texts, no emails, no breaking news alerts. The world was completely, totally, beautifully off. That right there, that feeling, that specific, unrepeatable Saturday morning in the early to mid 1990s feeling, that is what this show is about. Not just the cartoons, not just the cereal, but the feeling of being completely present in a world that hadn't figured out yet how to pull you in 17 different directions at once. A world where the culture was loud and alive, and everywhere you looked, something incredible was happening. Music, movies, sports, television, fashion, politics, all of it colliding at the same time in the same decade, making something that we have been chasing ever since. And to that I say, welcome to In Case I Missed It, 90s edition. Let's go.
90s, baby.
What is up, everybody? Welcome to In Case I Missed It. I am your host, Alex, and if you found the show, if this podcast or this video somehow made it, to your ears or to your screen today, then, well, congratulations. You have excellent taste, impeccable judgment, and somewhere in your soul, I guarantee you, there is a part of you that has been waiting for something like this, because we are going back every single week for the next year. We're going to go back to the greatest decade in modern history. And I'm going to do my best to come in here every week, by the way. We're going to be breaking it all the way down. The music, the movies, the sports, the TV shows, the fashion. Yes, all of it. Even the things we maybe should have left in the 90s. We're talking about the culture, the moments, the people, the controversies, the nostalgia. And yes, occasionally, the absolute chaos that only the 90s could produce. Now, before we get into today's episode, let me just be real with you for a second, all right, about who this show is actually for, because I want to be clear with you. This show is for you if you lived the 90s. If you went to school in the 90s, came to age in the 90s, worked in the 90s, raised your kids in the 90s, if the 90s were your decade in real time and you still find yourself referencing that era like it was just last Tuesday, this show is for you. Certainly for me. This show is also for you if you were born in the 90s, right? But feel like maybe you missed most of it because you were too young. If you were like 5 years old in 1997 and you have these fuzzy, warm memories of things, but you don't fully know the whole story, this show is for you too. And honestly, this show is even for you if you didn't live through the 90s at all. If you were born in 2000, whatever, and you've spent the last few years going back and watching 90s shows and listening to 90s music and wearing 90s fashion and wondering why does this era feel so different, so alive, so real? I'm going to answer that question for you episode by episode. We drop every week. Episodes here are going to run for maybe about an hour, okay? We go deep on everything we cover. This is not a surface level, hey, remember Tamagotchi situation? We're going to actually talk about this stuff, the history, the context, the behind the scenes, the hot takes, the debates, all of it. And I want to be clear about one more thing before we get into today's episode. This show has a point of view. I'm not neutral on the 90s. I am fully, completely, entirely biased. I think the 90s was the greatest decade in modern history, and I'm going to make that case every single week with evidence, passion, and a level of commitment that some people might call concerning. You see, we're just going to hang out and we're going to let things ride. All right? And I'm going to do it with love and passion. And I hope that you're straddled in and ready for this journey with me. Now that we've got all that out of the way, let's get into this episode. And today, fittingly, we are starting at the very beginning. Before we get into specific artists or movies or shows or sports moments in future episodes, I need to lay the foundation first. I need to make the case, the full, comprehensive, receipts in hand case for why the 90s was the greatest decade in modern history. Because some of y'all out there are going to challenge me. I know you are. Some of you are going to come to my comments with, what about the 60s? Or what about the 80s? And I respect all of those years, all those decades. But by the time this episode is over, I want you to be able to go anywhere, have anyone try to argue with you about this, and you walk away victorious every single time. So, let's jump in and get right into it, won't we? So here's the thing about the 90s that I think gets lost in a lot of the nostalgia conversation. People talk about, it like it was just a feeling, like the 90s were great because we were kids and everything feels great when you're a kid and you didn't have bills and responsibilities, all of that, right? And look, I hear that. There's some truth to that. Being a kid in a good era is genuinely better than being an adult in a good era. I'll give them that. But here's what I refuse to accept. The idea that the 90s were only good because we were young. That if we had been the same age, let's say in the late 2000s, we'd feel exactly the same way about that era. Because that is factually incorrect. And I can prove it. The 90s were objectively, measurably, documentably the greatest cultural decade in modern history. And I'm going to give you five pillars of that argument today. 5 separate categories where the 90s didn't just do well, they did things that have never been replicated ever since, okay? Before and since, all right? We're going to start off with the music. Let me ask you something. Let me just put this into your brain. Name me another decade, and I'll wait. Name me another decade where every single genre of music was simultaneously having the greatest era at the same time. Hip hop, the 90s was the golden age of hip hop. Full stop. You want to talk about the greatest albums ever recorded? Reasonable Doubt, Illmatic, Ready to Die, All Eyes on Me, The Chronic, Enter the Wu-Tang, Hello, The Miseducation of Lauryn Hill. Every single one of those is from the 90s. Every single one. And that's not even a complete list. That's just me being a conservative about it. Ugh. R&B? Are you kidding me? Boyz II Men, Aaliyah, TLC, Mary J. Blige, Mariah Carey in her absolute prime, Babyface producing half the decade, Keith Sweat, Genuine, Usher getting started. Guys, the 90s R&B scene was so stacked that artists who would have been superstars in any other decade were second tier in the 90s because the competition was just ridiculous. Rock and grunge? Nirvana changed music forever in 1991, and the shockwave from that album, Nevermind, was still being felt 5 years later. Pearl Jam, Soundgarden, Alice in Chains, Stone Temple Pilots, and then alternative rock exploding alongside all of this. The Smashing Pumpkins, Radiohead, Sublime, No Doubt, Green Day. You couldn't turn on the radio without hearing something that was genuinely changing the entire sonic landscape of music. Now let's talk about pop. Probably one of the biggest ones, right? You got Britney Spears, the Spice Girls, Backstreet Boys, NSYNC. Even Madonna still in her prime for the first half of the decade. Mariah crossing between pop and R&B in a way nobody had done before. This is the pop era that everyone still references when they talk about what pop music is supposed to sound like. Country music? Hey, Garth Brooks became the best-selling solo artist in American history ahead of Elvis during the 90s. Shania Twain, Faith Hill, Tim McGraw. The 90s made country crossover, right? In a way, it literally had never done before. You can't forget about electronic music, by the way. Electronic music was emerging. Latin music was crossing over. Jazz was having some type of revival on its own. Even gospel was in a renaissance. I'm not exaggerating when I tell you that every single genre of music was at a creative peak simultaneously during this decade. That has never happened before. It has not happened since, and I genuinely do not believe it will ever happen again. Now, that was number one. Now let's talk about the movies, because the 90s was the last great decade of cinema, and I know that's a strong statement. So let me back that up before I get somebody in the comment section. The early 90s gave us the last gasp of the director-driven blockbuster films where a single visionary behind the camera had total creative control and used to make something unforgettable. Spielberg in the 90s alone gave us Schindler's List, Jurassic Park, Amistad, 3 of those in one decade. Any one of those would define most directors' entire career. But it wasn't just Spielberg. James Cameron made Terminator 2 in 1991 and then topped himself with Titanic in 1997, the highest grossing movie in history at that time. A film so massive, it basically broke the concept of what a movie could do. All right. They invented a whole new visual language, all right? Like The Matrix. Quentin Tarantino burst onto the scene with Pulp Fiction and Reservoir Dogs and rewired how storytelling in film was allowed to work. All right, David Fincher, Seven and Fight Club, both in this decade. Stanley Kubrick's last film, Eyes Wide Shut, 1999. The 90s closed with what many consider one of the single greatest years in film history. And that's just the prestige end of things. The blockbusters, Home Alone, Point Break, The Silence of the Lambs, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin, The Lion King, which we are going to do an entire episode on because it deserves it. Don't forget Forrest Gump, Speed, Apollo 13, Independence Day, Jerry Maguire, Good Will Hunting, LA Confidential, As Good as It Gets. One of my favorites, Saving Private Ryan. This is not a complete list. This is just me naming films off the top of my head and landing on back to back to back to back certified classics every single time. Now, black cinema in the 90s deserves its own conversation, and we will have it. Boys in the Hood, Menace to Society, Friday, Set It Off, Waiting to Exhale, Poetic Justice. These films told stories about Black American life with a specific and authenticity, right? That the industry had never allowed before. And they built careers that changed Hollywood forever. John Singleton got an Academy Award nomination for Boys in the Hood when he was 24 years old. 24. And then there's the animated film renaissance. Disney's run from The Little Mermaid in 1989 through The Lion King in 1994 and continuing through Mulan and Tarzan at the end of the decade is arguably the greatest consecutive run of animated films from a single studio in the history of cinema. And Toy Story came out in 1995 and invented an entirely new form of animation and launched Pixar into one of the most dominant creative forces in Hollywood history. All of that in one decade. I could genuinely spend this entire episode just on movies. And honestly, part of me wants to. But I've got more pillars to get through, and I don't want to bore you. So let's keep it moving. We're going to continue on here. Right after the movies, let's talk about television. You know what the 90s did for TV that doesn't get talked about enough. The 90s invented the modern television landscape. The shows that defined how TV works were created in this decade. Think about what was on the air simultaneously. I don't know. Pick a year. 1995. I'll pick it for you. You've got Friends, which launched the era of the ensemble sitcom that every network would spend the next 20 years trying to pretty much replicate. You've got The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, which turned Will Smith into one of the biggest stars on the planet. You've got Seinfeld, and I want you to really pay attention to what I'm about to tell you, because it was a show described as being about nothing. Became one of the most watched, most quoted, most culturally influential programs in TV history. About nothing. That's insane. Let's talk about ER. Remember ER? Which reinvented the medical drama. NYPD Blue, which pushed the boundary of what could be shown on network television. You've got Homicide, Life on the Street, which is one of the most criminally underrated dramas I believe ever made. Can't forget about The X-Files, which invented the long-form mythology storyline that every prestige drama uses today. You've got Twin Peaks finishing its run. You've got The Simpsons in its absolute golden era. Season 3 through 9 of The Simpsons are some of the most perfectly constructed television episodes I think ever written. You've got Roseanne and Home Improvement and Everybody Loves Raymond and a sitcom landscape so freaking packed that you could watch TV for 12 hours straight and not run out of genuinely, that's a big word I've been using today. Great shows. And then there's black television in the freaking 90s, which is a whole conversation. Living Single, which premiered a year before Friends and had a nearly identical premise and somehow gets half the cultural credit. Martin, which gave us some of the most iconic comedic performances in television history. A Different World. The Fresh Prince, as I said before. Moesha, the Jamie Foxx Show. Family Matters. I love that show still today. Steve Urkel became literally the most famous fictional character in America for a period of time in the early 90s. I want you to sit with that. You need to let that one sink in, okay? And for the kids, Nickelodeon was creating the greatest children's programming slate in television history. Rugrats, Hey Arnold, Clarissa Explains It All, The Ren and Stimpy Show, Rocko's Modern Life, Doug, Legends of the Hidden Temple, Double Dare. Are you afraid of the dark? Nickelodeon in the 90s, bro, was basically running a second golden age of television just for children. Simultaneously, by the way, while the adults had their own golden age happening on other channels. That, and I repeat, that has never happened before the 90s or after. Every demographic, every genre, every network, all cooking at the same freaking time. Now let's talk about sports. I'm just gonna say some names and I want you to feel each one. We'll start off with Michael Jordan. That's it. I can stop right now. Michael Jordan playing basketball in the 90s, specifically the 6 championship Bulls teams, is the single greatest sustained athletic performance in history of professional sports. I don't say that to be provocative. I say it because it is the consensus opinion of almost every sports analyst, historian, and athlete who has ever been asked. 6 championships, 6 finals MVP awards, no losses in the finals, a comeback from retirement in the middle of the decade that immediately produced 2 more championships. Have you guys heard of the Last Dance documentary, which we will also be doing a full episode on? Well, that came out in 2020 and it broke streaming records because people who had watched Jordan play still couldn't get enough of it. That's what the 90s sports did. It created moments so massive they're still generating content 30 years later. And I mean, we can't even forget about those iconic 90s Cowboys team, iconic Yankee teams. It's all there. But Jordan isn't even the whole story, right? Let's stay here on NBA. The 1992 Dream Team, USA Basketball assembles, right, the greatest collection of basketball talent ever put on a single roster and sends them all to the Olympics. Jordan, Magic Johnson, Larry Bird, Charles Barkley, Patrick Ewing, Scottie Pippen, Karl Malone, John Stockton, Chris Mullin. They didn't just win gold. They averaged a 44-point margin of victory. Other national teams were asking for autographs before the game. Their opponents were taking photos with them on the medal stand. That team is often cited as the moment basketball truly went global and became the second most popular sport on earth. The 1994 World Cup also came to the United States for the first time. 94,000 people packed the Rose Bowl for the final. In America, a country that, at the time, many around the world assumed didn't care about soccer. The tournament shattered attendance records that are probably still held to this day. I mentioned this name right here, Mike Tyson. Mike Tyson, before his downfall, was the most feared athlete on the planet. Ken Griffey Jr. was playing baseball in a way that made people who didn't like baseball become baseball fans. Emmitt Smith, Barry Sanders, Jerry Rice were doing things in the NFL that defied physics. Wayne Gretzky was finishing a career in hockey that so thoroughly dominated the record books that his records make no mathematical sense. He has more assists than the second highest scorer in NHL history has total points. Think about that. Then there's Pete Sampras and Andre Agassi. They were in the middle of careers that defined a generation of tennis. Tiger Woods burst onto the PGA Tour and at the end of the decade and immediately changed absolutely everything. We used to talk about this all the time in the lunchroom, specifically tennis for some weird reason. Sports in the 90s was appointment television. Every event felt like something you couldn't miss. Something was always happening, always evolving, always generating a moment that people would talk about for freaking decades. Now let's talk about the last pillar here. We're going to talk about the culture of the 90s. This one is harder to quantify, but it might be the most important because the 90s had a culture, okay? Listen to me, like a specific, tangible, identifiable, shared culture that cuts across music and fashion and language and behavior in a way that is actually kind of staggering when you look back at it. The fashion alone oversized everything. Windbreakers, cross colors, Carcanais, Tommy Hilfiger, when Tommy Hilfiger actually meant something specific. Air Jordans as a cultural status symbol. Timberland boots worn by rappers and construction workers alike, and somehow being correct in both contexts. platform shoes, velvet chokers, frosted tips. Yes, we are including frosted tips because they happened and we have to own them. The fashion in the 90s was so specific and so alive. It's been in full revival for the past decade. Every single fashion trend from the 90s has come back. The fashion industry knows what the kids today know. The 90s aesthetic was it. We're going to talk about the slang, things like talk to the hand, as if, whatever. That's the bomb, no doubt, word. The 90s gave us a vocabulary that embedded itself so deep in the culture that half of these phrases are still in casual rotation 30 plus years later, and nobody questions it, right? And the shared experience. Oh, this might be the thing I come back to most on this show, over and over again. Because the 90s were the last decade of shared mass culture. Before the internet fragmented everything right into a billion niche communities, before streaming broke up the monoculture, before the algorithm figured out how to show each person a completely different freaking reality, the 90s were when we all watched the same things, heard the same songs, wore the same styles, and talked about the same moments the next day at school or at work or at the barbershop, whatever. That shared experience created a connective tissue between people that we are genuinely struggling to replicate now in the digital age. And I genuinely believe that part of the reason the 90s nostalgia is so powerful is not just that those things were great, it's that experiencing them together was great. And honestly, we miss that. And look, I know some of you are listening to this or watching and thinking about things in the 90s that weren't great. And you're not wrong. There were things that were genuinely problematic. There were conversations that weren't being had. There were people who were being left out or overlooked or actively harmed. And throughout this show, I'm going to be honest about all of that too. Because pretending the 90s were perfect isn't nostalgia. That's just revisionism. But acknowledging the complicated parts doesn't mean we can't also celebrate what was undeniably, extraordinarily great. And there was so much that was great. So that is the case, ladies and gentlemen. 5 pillars. Music, movies, television, sports, culture. The 90s didn't just win in one category. They ran the table. And that is why we're here. That is why this show exists. And that is why every week we are gonna go back. All right, look, we have made the case, or at least I have. The 90s were the greatest decade. If you are not convinced yet, stay with me, because I've got more to talk about. And I promise I will change your mind if you don't think so. But right now, we're going into one of my favorite segments here on the show, because every episode, I'm going to bring you 5 things, 5 facts, 5 stories, 5 behind the scene moments about the topic of the week that people won't really know or don't know about. Things that when you hear them, make you stop and go, wait, what? What is he talking about? And the theme for this first episode's Did You Know segment is 5 facts about the 90s as a whole that will make you see the entire decade differently. All right, friends, are you ready? Let's just start. Let's do this right now. Let's start with Did You Know, number 1. The entire decade of the 90s happened without Wikipedia. Without Google, without smartphones, without social media, without streaming, without GPS, without DVDs for the first 6 years of it, without email being widely used by regular people. And I'll emphasize this, all of this stuff that I just mentioned was not used by regular people until around 94 or 95, okay? Maybe even later. Now, I know that sounds obvious when I say it like that, but I want you to really sit with what that means, because we're talking about a decade that produced the greatest music, the greatest movies, the greatest sport moments, the greatest TV shows. greatest video games that we've been referencing and celebrating and studying ever since. And the people who made all of that didn't have access to the collective knowledge of all of human history on a device in their pocket. Here's an example. Kendrick Lamar drops an album, right? You could drop an album today, and he has access to every album ever recorded, every review ever written, every sample ever flipped, every obscure reference he wants to pull from instantly for free from his bed. Biggie was writing songs with a pen and paper in Brooklyn, pulling from what he'd hear on the radio and what was happening on the streets. Jay-Z famously doesn't write his lyrics down at all. He memorizes them, partly because the conditions of creation in the 90s demanded a different kind of process. The filmmakers of the 90s were researching at libraries. The fashion designers were sketching by hand. The architects of the 90s culture were building it without a blueprint and without a safety net. And somehow the result was the richest cultural decade in modern history. That tells you something. It tells you that the constraints weren't a limitation. Actually, they were fuel. Let's move on to Did You Know number 2. Woo. And this one's going to get you. Because the average price of a gallon of gasoline in 1990 was $1.16. I know. And by 1999, it had risen all the way to $1.17. 9 years, 1 cent. I want you to sit with that for a moment because we are in a completely different reality right now, and understanding how cheap certain things were in the 90s actually changes how you understand the culture. People had more discretionary income as a percentage of their earnings. The mall was affordable. The movies were affordable. A movie ticket in 1993 was about $4.50 on average. Eating out was affordable. Concerts were affordable. You could take your family to see a major artist perform for what it now costs to park your car at the damn venue. The economic context of the 90s matters for understanding why the culture was so vibrant. The economy was broadly doing well for much of the decade. Unemployment was falling. The tech boom was creating all new wealth. Middle-class families had more to spend on entertainment, and the entertainment industry responded by creating more and better entertainment. That's not a coincidence, friends. That is not a coincidence. Let's go to Did You Know number 3. Titanic. The film that became the highest grossing movie in history and won 11 Academy Awards, including Best Picture, nearly bankrupted 20th Century Fox before it was even released. Here are the facts. The film was originally budgeted at $100 million. By the time production wrapped, it had cost over $200 million. At the time, the most expensive movie ever made. The production ran so far over schedule and over budget that Fox executives were having genuine, serious conversations about pulling the plug mid-production. The studio was openly panicking. There were reports that James Cameron was willing to forfeit his entire director's fee and his percentage of profits just to be allowed to finish the damn film. Cameron, one of the biggest directors in Hollywood, was essentially begging to be allowed to complete his own movie. Now, the film was originally scheduled to release in July of 1997. Fox pushed it to December because they needed more time and because they were bracing for a catastrophe. You see, industry insiders were predicting it would be the biggest bomb in Hollywood history. One writer called it the most spectacular failure since Heaven's Gate. The studio was already working on how they were going to absorb all the loss. Titanic ended up grossing $600 billion domestically, $1.8 billion worldwide. It was the highest grossing film in history for 12 years until James Cameron surpassed it with his own film, Avatar, in 2010. Fox made an enormous fortune off a film they were convinced was going to destroy them. Sometimes being wrong is the best thing that can happen to you. Did you know number 4? The Fresh Prince of Bel-Air almost didn't cast Will Smith, and you probably knew that. If you didn't, I'm going to tell you. Will Smith had already made his name as a rapper. The Fresh Prince, one half of DJ Jazzy Jeff and The Fresh Prince, and he'd done some TV work, but when NBC was developing the show, Will Smith was not the obvious choice. He wasn't a trained actor. He had limited experience and he had a very serious financial problem. He owed a significant amount in back taxes to the IRS, which had been withholding a portion of his income. And he was essentially broke at the time when he auditioned. Quincy Jones, the legendary music producer and one of the creators of the show, saw something in Smith that the network wasn't fully seeing yet. Jones famously championed Smith for the role when there were doubts. He believed that Smith's natural charisma, his ability to be funny without seeming to try, and his specific kind of relatable charm could anchor a sitcom. And obviously, well, he was right. But here's the thing. Will Smith has said in interviews that getting Fresh Prince wasn't just a career opportunity for him. It was financial survival for him. The IRS deal that NBC helped broker to get his taxes cleared was part of what made the show possible. One of the most beloved TV shows in the 90s. The launchpad for one of the biggest movie careers in history came into existence partly because Will Smith desperately needed money and Quincy Jones believed in him when the numbers suggested that, well, maybe you shouldn't. And finally, did you know number 5? And this one is the one that I think really pretty much encapsulates something essential about the 90s. In 1999, a small independent horror film was made for approximately $60,000. It was shot over 8 days in the woods of Maryland. The film had no famous cast, no special effects, no studio backing. The marketing budget was essentially zero. The filmmakers uploaded a website with a fictional backstory about a real witch who haunted the woods, right? And they submitted the film to Sundance, where it was picked up and released. And by the way, I used to check that website weekly, daily. Freaked me out. Of course, we're talking about the Blair Witch Project, which grossed $248 million worldwide on a $60,000 budget. It invented the found footage horror genre. It changed how horror films were made, marketed, and distributed. It is studied in film schools to this day as one of the most effective examples of viral marketing in history. And it was doing viral marketing before the word viral even entered cultural vocabulary. And here's what I want you to understand about why that story is a 90s story. That could only have happened in the late 90s. The internet was just mainstream enough to make the viral marketing possible, but just immature enough that people could still be genuinely fooled into thinking the mythology was real. I was one of them. The film culture was still open enough that an unknown indie film could get a Sundance slot and a wide theatrical release, and the horror genre was hungry enough for something, new and scary that audiences responded in enormous numbers. What a time. Every single one of those conditions was specific to 1999. Move that film 5 years earlier, it doesn't work because the internet infrastructure isn't there. Move it 5 years later, and everyone's already too media savvy to believe it, right? The Blair Witch Project is a film that could only have been made and released and succeeded in the exact moment it was made and released, and guess what? Succeeded. It is a time capsule. It is a 90s artifact. And it is one of my favorite examples of why this decade was unlike anything before or since. Now, this is the versus segment. Every episode, I'm going to put 2 things from the 90s head to head, or I'm going to put the 90s up against something else entirely, right? Today, since this is our first episode, and we're making the case for the decade, I'm going all the way in. Today's versus is the 90s versus every other decade in modern history. Yep. I'm going to go decade by decade. I'm going to respect the competition. And then I'm going to tell you why exactly the 90s always wins. And we're going to start with the one that's going to get the most pushback. The 90s versus the 80s. I love the 80s. I want to be clear about that. The 80s had incredible music. Michael Jackson in the 80s is the greatest pop star who ever lived, giving the performance of a lifetime. Prince in the 80s, Madonna building her mythology, Bruce Springsteen's Born in the USA, the 80s rock scene. The 80s had John Hughes films that defined the teenage experience in cinema for an entire generation. It had the beginning of hip hop, Grandmaster Flash, Run DMC, the Beastie Boys crossing into the mainstream. The 80s had a cultural energy that was real and significant and still influential. But here's my argument for why the 90s win. The 80s created things, and the 90s perfected things. Everything that the 80s started, hip hop, alternative rock, the big pop star, the blockbuster movie, prestige TV. The 90s took all of it and elevated it to the greatest possible form. The 80s wrote the first draft, and the 90s wrote the final draft. And the final draft is better than the first draft. That's just how drafts work. Okay? You can fight me on that. Also, and I say this with love, the 80s had some of the most aggressively questionable fashion decisions, I think, in human history. Hair that defied gravity, colors that should not have been combined, shoulder pads that were genuinely dangerous in a crowded room. The 90s made fashion cool again. I rest my case. You want to fight me on that too? Let's talk about the 90s versus the 60s. My mom was born in the 60s. Now, this is the one where I have to be most careful because the 60s is the decade that a lot of people, particularly people of a certain generation, will point to as the greatest decade in history. All right? And the case for the 60s is real. The Beatles, the Rolling Stones, Bob Dylan, Motown at its peak, the civil rights movement, the moon landing, Woodstock, the birth of the counterculture. The 60s changed the world in ways that echo through everything that came after it. Hell, including the 90s. But here's my respectful counter argument. The 60s changed the world. The 90s inherited that change and made something really beautiful with it. The 90s was the decade where many of the promises of the 60s, right, started partially, imperfectly, but genuinely being kept, right? Because hip hop artists were having conversations about race and justice and power that were direct descendants of the civil rights movement. Black filmmakers were getting opportunities and resources that their predecessors in the 60s were fighting just to have acknowledged as possible. Women in music and film and sports were achieving things in the 90s that the women of the 60s were laying the entire groundwork for. And culturally, not politically, but culturally, the 90s produced more that has directly shaped the present moment than the 60s. The movies, the music, the TV shows that people in their 20s and 30s are actively consuming and referencing right now are overwhelmingly from the 90s. I have tremendous respect for the 60s, but the 90s is the decade that got you to today. I want to put the 90s versus the 2020s. And I'm going to be gentle here because I know some of you are fully invested in current culture. And I respect it. Right now is genuinely an interesting time for certain things. The production quality of music right now is extraordinary. Streaming has pretty much, given access to content in a way that has real value. Some television being made right now, prestige TV. I'm not everything was better back then type of person across the board, okay? I just want to say that. But here's my honest observation, and I say this not to be negative, but to be real. The 2020s so far have been heavily characterized by looking backward. The biggest fashion trend of the 2020s is 90s fashion. The most sampled era in current music and production is the 90s. The shows and movies getting the most cultural attention are either 90s IPs that are being rebooted or direct homages to the 90s aesthetics. The algorithm is constantly surfacing 90s content because the demand for it never went away. When a decade is so great that the generation that comes 2 decades after can't stop going back to it, that is the definition of the greatest decade. The 90s are not nostalgia. The 90s are a reference point. There's a difference. Nostalgia is, I miss that. A reference point is, that is the standard. The 90s are the standard, okay? And the fact that we keep returning to them over and over and over in fashion and in music, in the film industry, hell, this podcast, it proves it. All right, friends, hot take time. And I need you to hear me out on this before you come to my comments. And because this one might sound a little philosophical at first, but I want to bring it home in a way that's going to make sense for all of us. Because my hot take for this first episode is this. The 90s were the greatest decade in modern history, partly significantly because they were the last decade where human beings were allowed to be bored. Stay with me. Before the smartphone, before social media, before streaming and YouTube, and TikTok, and on-demand everything, before the era of constant content and instant access and perpetual stimulation, there was a space in everyday life called boredom. And I'm not talking about miserable boredom. I'm talking about the boredom that happens when you've got a Saturday afternoon with nothing specific to do and no device in your pocket to fill that space. So your brain, your actual creative, imaginative human brain, has to go somewhere on its own. You know what happened in those moments in the 90s? People made things. People called their friends and talked for hours about nothing in particular. Kids went outside and invented games that didn't come in a box. Teenagers developed obsessions with a band, with a movie, with a book. That went deep because there was nothing else competing for their attention at that exact moment. Adults sat on their porches and had conversations with their neighbors because the neighbor was literally the most interesting thing available at that moment. I fell in love with comic books and trading cards and films. Started writing my own things even at a young age. The culture of the 90s was built in those in-between moments. The mixtape, arguably the best intimate cultural artifact of the decade, was a product of boredom and attention. You sat with your radio and your blank cassette tape and you waited for the right song to come on. And when it did, you hit record and you curated slowly, deliberately, an experience for someone you cared about. There was no drag and drop playlist. There was time and intention in the specific kind of love that only gets expressed when someone is willing to be patient. The fashion choices of the 90s, the slang, the way people carried themselves, all of it developed organically in real time through actual human-to-human contact and observation, not through an algorithm deciding what you should look like based on what you got the most engagement on, right? You develop style by watching people around you, by experimenting, by looking ridiculous for a while and figuring out what actually worked. That process is slow and sometimes embarrassing, and that is exactly why it produced something authentic. Here's my hot take within the hot take. It's my show. I can do this. I think a significant amount of the creative and cultural richness of the 90s came directly from the absence of distraction. And I think the reason we struggle to replicate the richness today is not because talented people don't exist. They absolutely do, but because talent that never gets to be bored never gets to figure out what it actually wants to say. Every breakthrough creative moment in history has involved a period of silence, of stuckness, of not knowing what comes next and having to sit with that discomfort until the answer appears. The 90s were structurally full of that silence. Today, the moment silence arrives, we fill it with our phones. This podcast came to life out of boredom out of, not out of boredom, but out of that quiet space. I was just thinking. It took me a year and a half to perfect this and put it into paper. All right. And I had a lot of silence in between. And I'm not saying we should throw our phones away in the ocean or whatever. I'm not talking about that. See, I use the internet. I have social media. I understand the value of connection and access, all of that. Okay? But I am saying that something was lost when we eliminated boredom from daily life. And I am saying that the 90s represent the last era where the conditions for deep, unhurried, uninterrupted creative and human experience were baked into everyday life by default. Not by choice, not by discipline, just by the simple fact that the technology to constantly interrupt yourself didn't exist yet. You probably got interrupted like 50,000 times while listening to this or watching it. And I think that's worth understanding, not just as nostalgia, but as an explanation for why the decade produced what it produced. And maybe as a suggestion that if you want to feel more connected to that energy, if you want to tap into something that feels a little more like the 90s in your creative life or in your personal life, the answer might be simpler than what you think. Put the phone down, be bored for a minute, hell, see what shows up. Friends, we are at the end of episode 1, and I just want to say sincerely, thank you. Thank you for being here for the very first episode of the show. Whether you found this on Apple Podcasts or YouTube or somebody sent it to you or you just stumbled into it somehow, you being here, well, it means everything to me, and I do not take it lightly. This show is something I've wanted to make for a long time because the 90s genuinely changed my life, right? I grew up in them. The music that came out of that decade that shaped how I hear everything, the movies that shaped how I tell stories and why I am a filmmaker today, the sports shaped what I understand about excellence and what it means to compete and give everything you have, the TV shows and the culture and the fashion and the whole entire world of that decade, it made me who I am. And I suspect that if you are here, it made you who you are too. And I think we deserve a show that treats all of that with the seriousness and the love and the depth it deserves. Not a trivia show, not just a, hey, remember this nostalgia hit. A show that actually digs into the 90s and finds the context and the stories and the debates and the things you didn't know and comes back every week with more. That's what we're building here. That's what, in case I missed it, is going to be. So here is what I need from you before you go. First, if you're listening on Apple Podcasts, I need a 5-star review. I know everyone says it. I know it sounds like a podcast homework, but reviews on Apple Podcasts are genuinely one of the most important signals, and that tells the platform, which uses to decide which show to surface to new listeners. If this show made you feel something today, if the moment, one story, one argument hit different, that's worth a 5-star review, I think. It takes literally 30 seconds. It helps the show more than you know. Second, subscribe on YouTube, right here. Hit subscribe, hit the bell so you get notified when new episodes drop. On podcast apps, hit follow or subscribe so it automatically downloads every week. We're going to drop every Saturday, just like our favorite Saturday morning cartoons. Make it part of your routine. And last but not least, share it. Think about one person in your life who would absolutely lose their mind for this type of show. Your friend who quotes 90s movies constantly. Maybe your coworker who still knows every lyric to every song from 1994. Maybe your sibling who has the Fresh Prince intro memorized in their brains. Send them this episode. Tell them you found their show, because that's what this is. Now, before I let you go, for real, I want to tease next week's episode because you are going to want to make sure you are here for this. Because next week, we're going to go deep on Saturday morning cartoons, the full history of the greatest Saturday morning TV lineup in the history of American children's programming. Rugrats, Hey Arnold, Animaniacs, X-Men, Batman the Animated Series, The Tick. We're going to talk about why these shows were so good. What was actually happening behind the scenes at these networks. and make the argument for why the 90s animation was not just good kids' TV, it was genuinely some of the best writing on television, period, for any audience of any age. You do not want to miss that episode. Set your reminder, tell a friend. All right, that's episode 1. That's the foundation. That's the case. I've made it. I stand by it, and I'll be back again next Saturday to make it again from a different angle. I'm Alex, and as always, in case you missed it, the 90s were better. See you next week.